Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being with us. I hope you're enjoying the conference. It's been a long, long day, a lot of great speakers. I'm feeling a little tired, but energized to be among so many great advocates who are working on important issues in their communities back home. Today, our panel is focused on countering the criminalization of homelessness, and I really can't think of a more important topic right now at this moment. We have some great speakers with us today. To my right, we have Donald Whitehead Jr., the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. We have Lisa Glow, who's the CEO of Central Arizona Shelter Services. Markea Watson, Executive Director of the Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness. And Carlton, a fan club here, and Carlton Martin, a pro bono director of the National Homelessness Law Center. I wanted to start off by framing a little bit of why we chose to have this breakout session. And it's really because we're at a crisis and a crossroads. We're seeing more state, local, and federal policymakers that are putting forward dangerous rhetoric and harmful measures that make it even harder for people to exit homelessness. And we're seeing a growing backlash against people who are unhoused and a return back to the failed policies of the 1980s. One of the clearest ways that we're seeing this threat is through legislation that would seek to criminalize homelessness. And we're seeing this as unsheltered homelessness is increasing in many communities, as encampments are increasing. More and more measures are being put in place to put individuals in jail, to fine them if they sleep outside when they have nowhere else to go. We're also seeing legislation that moves us away from the proven solutions that we know work. So away from long-term permanent affordable housing, away from renter protections, and the clearest example of that is from the Cicero Institute. I'm not sure if those of you, can we get a show of hands, anybody who's aware of the Cicero Institute? So about half of the folks in the room know. This is a right-wing think tank that has put out draft legislation and is shopping it around actively in many states right now. It would use the force of the threat of criminalization to force unsheltered people into state-sanctioned encampments, to require treatment, to involuntarily institutionalize individuals, to punish jurisdictions that have higher rates of homelessness and that aren't enforcing their encamping bans. We've seen legislation be passed in Tennessee, making camping a felony. We've seen Missouri's law that allows the state's attorney general, or purports to at least allow them to divert federal funding away from affordable housing to put towards these state-sanctioned encampments. And it's happening everywhere. It's not just in red cities or red states. It's happening in blue cities as well. We saw this in DC just a month ago as well, where just last month, the National Park Service forcibly removed unhoused people from McPherson Square, 2 blocks from the White House, 2 months ahead of schedule during hypothermia season, even though nearly all of the people there weren't connected to housing. In fact, only 2 people were connected to housing. 2 people were arrested, and most others, as we know, moved to the next encampment over. It's not a solution for homelessness, and it's an excuse for criminalization of people who are already at the margins. I bring this up because it's important for us to know what our federal partners are able to bring or are willing to bring to the table. And for us, the fact that the Biden-Harris administration, while they're doing lots of great work on renter protections, we heard from that earlier, while they're pushing for major investments in affordable housing, they were still willing to follow DC government's advice and forcibly remove our unhoused neighbors, undermining the very strategic plan that they put in place that called for more humane options. So if the Biden administration isn't going to follow their own strategic advice about how to address homelessness, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for our cities and states to do the same thing and for elected officials to do that. So that's sort of the context in which we're here, where there's going to be a lot of need for all of us to be very vigilant when we go back to our homes to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of those who are most marginalized, most impacted by these criminalization efforts, and that we're working as strategically as possible to stop those efforts. So I want to start off by first turning to Carlton and Donald and wondering, can you speak to these growing threats that are facing people experiencing homelessness, and what's different about the Cicero legislation and other legislation than in the past?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and definitely want to thank all of you for being with us today. Donald Whitehead, and just a little bit about our organization. The National Coalition for the Homeless is actually the oldest organization that works directly with people experiencing homelessness. We were founded in the late 70s in New York City. We won a right to housing in New York City, and then became incorporated in DC. So throughout our history, we have certainly seen communities that relied on criminalization as a solution to homelessness. And in fact, just like when we talk about racial equity, the roots of this kind of action didn't start in the 80s, it didn't start in the 70s, it actually started at the founding of this country. So right as the country was discovered or colonized, whichever one you want to use, there were vagrancy laws that prevented people from moving from town to town. There were actually laws enacted that said that people could not rely on the welfare state in another community, and if you were found to be indigent and moving into a community, you could be arrested. And that was in place for years. In fact, it was in place for decades. In 1972, those laws were found to be unconstitutional, and vagrancy laws were taken off the books. But just like what has happened in our recent history, these laws were found to be unconstitutional in our current history. The Martin versus Boise decision that happened made it illegal to criminalize homelessness. And just like in 1972, communities basically ignored that. I started my work, there was a rampant onslaught of anti-panhandling laws around the country. And every time that they've been addressed from a legal standpoint, they've been found to be unconstitutional. So we keep defeating these laws, but they keep arising in other places in the country. We also, in the 90s, we saw a rash of laws that made it illegal to feed people experiencing homelessness. So this pattern is not new. And Carlton will speak a little bit more to this. What is new about this is these are random efforts that were happening in city to city. Now we're seeing a well-funded, funded by hedge fund operators, operation that's moving from city to city and providing model legislation. And they're also providing something that we know often happens when we do work with people experiencing homelessness or poor people in general. There is a whole cadre of misinformation that's being distributed around this country. Things like housing first doesn't work, that people can be forced into treatment and become clean. People can be forced into institutional settings, and that'll somehow cure their mental health, and they'll have housing on the other side. The most important thing to remember about criminalization is it does not solve homelessness. It's less cost effective than other measures, and although we've seen it for centuries, it's never been this pervasive. And we have often not seen it in progressive communities. Now we're seeing it happen in communities we thought to be progressive. And it's gotten to the extent where in Tennessee, anybody from Tennessee? It's actually a felony to be homeless, with up to 6 years in jail as a penalty. Think about that. It's a felony to be homeless. And even in the early parts of our country, homelessness was actually part of the description of those vagrancy laws. So it's been around for a long time, never like this. Carlton, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Donald. Well, first and foremost, how's everybody doing today? All right, we still with me? I know it's 3:45, day two. So just bear with me for a moment. But again, it's a pleasure to be here to speak with you today. I want to read a short little quote from Cicero's website. So they say, they argue that camping bans, along with the encouragement of temporary support, would encourage self-sufficiency and decrease violence to help the homeless get back on their feet. Now, on its face, that doesn't sound like a bad idea, right? Self-sufficiency, we all agree that's a good thing. But what that plays into, right, is it highlights the perception that homelessness is caused by individual failures rather than a systemic failure, right? These people made bad choices. They drank too much. They didn't handle their business. They didn't handle their responsibilities instead of looking at the policies and the cost of housing and those types of things. So my point of bringing that up and to frame this is that individuals who hold that belief and hold that perception are the ones that have the ears of the folks down the street here, are the ones that have the ears of state legislatures and policymakers across the country. All right, so so what's this emerging threat that we're talking about, right? With Cicero, their bill, I think their template bill was the Reducing Street Homelessness Act. All right, and so what that essentially does is it's a fight to control public space, right? By dealing with the visible symptoms of homelessness instead of some of those root causes. The Cicero kind of rose to fame really in 2019 when the city of Austin, Texas, they had they essentially rolled back a number of ordinances that banned camping, panhandling, sitting and lying in public. So the Institute successfully pushed Governor Abbott to adopt this kind of statewide template legislative bill to override the local decriminalization efforts. So that's what's new, right? So if you have a city who goes through the whole process to decriminalize, right, and in their jurisdiction, these statewide camping bans can override that. All right, does that make sense? They're coming in to override. And so just in the interest of time, let's get straight to the four primary elements that we've seen with these types of bills. A few of them have already been discussed, but one is statewide bans instead of local bans, right, of sleeping, lying, sitting, camping on public property. These bans are coming with increasingly higher jail times, right? 6-month sentences, up to a year, felonies, right? $5,000 in fines. Now, you hear a lot of things, right, at these types of conferences, a lot of stats, a lot of information that just flies over it. But what kind of sense does that make? To find someone who cannot afford housing $5,000 for camping on public property. They're not going to get that money, all right? So you're seeing a lot of that, and you can see some of these bills are encouraging the attorney generals of the states to enforce. Right? That's a very powerful tool. That sends a very powerful and chilling message. Do not camp on public property. The second element that we see is just a redirection of funds determined for permanent housing to short-term encampments. One of the things I didn't mention about even the first one is that what's in the bill is you can withhold funding it's an encouragement of withholding funding for housing if the jurisdiction is not enforcing that law, right? And so there's a redirection of funds that's also in this template bill that's being adopted. Forced institutionalization, right? Forced institutionalization. That's a major, that's our contention, is a major part of the CARES Act, right, out in California. Anybody from California? Mm-hmm. All right, forced institutionalization. The way that they word it, it sounds good, but it is never good to forcefully institutionalize anything, person, period, right? So the last piece is the law enforcement has to be a part of these homelessness outreach teams. Now, that's not new. But all of this is packaged together in these four elements where you have the statewide bans, the increased jail times, the fines, the redirection of funds determined for public housing, and then you have the introduction of law enforcement that has to be by law on homelessness outreach teams is what's in these Cicero bills. So kind of to bring this first part to a close, just in a different perspective, right? Who do you think law enforcement is going to choose if these bills are adopted to enforce that law against, all right? Anyone take a drive around D.C., what do you see? People of color. All right, now it affects everybody, and definitely at the National Homelessness Law Center, we care about all people. Okay, but we do know, based on the numbers, that a large majority of people who are, well, the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness by the numbers are persons of color. All right, and so this has a strong racial justice bent and angle to these laws, and we have to be aware of that. And the laws are spreading. So we'll talk more about that later. But these laws are the popularity of the, if you will, are spreading. And what we need to do is continue to get in front of it and strike these efforts down before they become a law.
I think it was so disheartening seeing the McPherson Square encampment raid, seeing tents, warm clothing, food thrown away from people who just couldn't carry everything with them as they went to the next encampment. But I'm wondering, it was also interesting to see the public response to it. A lot of that was not as sympathetic as I would have hoped, to put it mildly, and a lot of, I think the public just does not know that criminalization is not a solution to homelessness. And I'm wondering, Donald, if you can share a little bit more about how broad those impacts are on people experiencing homelessness when they're forced to go through these raids.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that those who are removed from homelessness, who don't understand all of the underlying issues, don't understand the impact. And I started with the impact of people who are criminalized, people who are forced into institutional settings. Their homelessness isn't solved. Once they leave that institutional setting, whether it's a jail or a mental health facility, we have not solved their homelessness. And it's been tried many times, but there's so many other things. I think one of the most important is health-related issues that are connected to people being forcibly removed. If anybody out there has been an outreach worker or is an outreach worker now, you know that progressive engagement can take years sometimes. And as soon as it happens, as soon as somebody's camp is raided, you completely dismantle the trust that's been created over that time. It really puts outreach workers that are really a situation where there's no win. So either the people experiencing homelessness believe that they're a part of the raid, or that they haven't supported them enough in the raid, and so you lose that trust. We've seen, as Sarah said, so many resources being thrown away, and it's not just the tents and the blankets, it's also medical equipment, it's medicine, sometimes it's wheelchairs. And in one instance in D.C., and if anybody's from D.C., they get mad at me when I talk about this, they actually picked up people in the tent. So when they started to do the raid, they didn't realize someone was still in the tent, and a bulldozer picked up people. And that's happened many times. We've seen pets destroyed. We've seen people lose things like Narcan, so it contributes to overdoses. So there's all kinds of medical issues. If you're a direct service worker, you've started a process to get that person in housing. Well, that has to be restarted once that person's relocated, because we often don't know what camp they're going to, and all of that has to be redone. The National Healthcare for the Homeless has also seen a direct relationship between shortened lifespans and raids. So we're actually shortening people's lives when we do this. The other thing, we've worked over the years on hate crimes reports. And we know right here in D.C., we had a serial killer just last year that went from New York to D.C. just randomly killing people experiencing homelessness. When we move people out of encampments that sometimes they enter into for a sense of community, and we put them in places where they're isolated, they are more susceptible to violence against them, and we've seen that documented over and over again. So there are so many different issues. I could go on and talk about the ways that this negatively impacts people simply waiting for their chance to be in a housing unit. And these are raids. I hope you heard Sarah say raid, because these aren't sweeps. We don't sweep people. We sweep trash. We sweep leaves. These are raids, and it's happening over and over again. And there are just so many different things. And most importantly, it's less cost effective than most of the other really well-defined, well-proven solutions that we have. So most of this is exacerbating homelessness for people, and the effects can't be undersold. There are many more effects that happen to people, but the health-related effects are really, really troubling. The cost is troubling, and also the dislocation of some of those relationships that have been so critical in moving people through the system. I think those are, for me, the biggest. I know there's certainly more that I'm not thinking about, but those are really, really issues that we have to continue to make sure that those that are in communities that are calling for raids and those that are in elected positions. And finally, I'll just say this is a state and local issue. Nobody's criminalizing people at the federal level. So when you get back home, it's up to us to really make sure that we're making sure that people understand the real consequences that happen when people are raided.
I just want to thank Donald for grounding the conversation in the disgusting. There's really no other word. Terrible practice of what a raid is, and also for teaching me about using the correct word of a raid. We've made a switch at the organization to only refer to this experience as being a raid or forcibly removing people. We're no longer using the word sweeps because we want to get across exactly what Donald had pointed out. I want to dig in a little bit deeper to what this experience means at the state level. We've seen Cicero legislation in Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, Missouri, Arizona, Kansas, the list goes on. And they've been really quite effective at connecting with lawmakers in those states, using really strategic on their end tactics to move the legislation forward. But I want to start with Lisa, because Lisa has done, and her colleagues and other advocates in the state have done a really remarkable job of neutralizing a lot of the really terrible parts of the Cicero bill that's been moving forward. There's a lot of great lessons there. And so I want Lisa, if you can, to tell us a little bit more about the legislation that's been introduced last session and this session. How have you been engaging lawmakers to improve the bill? And what are the tactics that you've seen Cicero use that other folks really need to be aware of so that when this bill comes to their state, they're prepared?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Lisa Glow. I'm the CEO of Central Arizona Shelter Services. We are an emergency shelter provider, the largest in the state. So there is a role in advocacy that we're committed to playing. That's not always true in the nonprofit sector. So I've been building relationships at the state legislature ever since I started 5.5 years ago, including with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And it's really relevant to the Cicero story because I built a relationship with Senator David Livingston, a very conservative Republican, who, when I started to educate him about the rising senior homelessness in our state, which is also a national crisis, he said, I want to help you with that. So second year, we didn't get our bill the first year to get funding for a additional shelter, but the second year he put it in the budget, really fought for it, had support. Pandemic budget happened, the bill got pulled, but he helped us get $7.5 million, and so we will be opening this summer what's called the Cass Senior Haven. It's our third shelter. We have a 600-bed congregate shelter. This is non-congregate if you want to read about it. It's in here. We're opening it this summer, 170 beds. So the long game in building those relationships is why we've been effective in working across the aisle on the Cicero legislation. So we faced 2 years of state efforts, but I do want to mention there also are local ordinances that are being passed that are banning urban camping. At least in Arizona, those efforts have been pretty benign. It's really, they talk about leading with services, and I don't think we're seeing raids from that. But all of our cities have ordinances that ban camping, and I suspect a lot of your cities do. Phoenix has ordinances, but they're not enforcing them. The Martin v. Boise case that was spoken about, which makes it, it says you cannot punish someone for their status. That's why it's unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment. It's cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. I note that. I'm a lawyer, and I use that a lot, that there's so many things in our history that we've tried to punish people for their status in this country, so I think that's an effective argument. But the local ones are more benign. Okay, let me get to the point. 2 years of efforts by Cicero. I first got involved last year when Senator Livingston called me, and the bill had been drafted by Cicero, this guy Jim Norton. He's the Darth Vader in this story. He asked me to take a look at this and if I could support it. And I looked at it and I'm like, that part has to go, that part has to go. You're going to have a big fight on your hands. And I said, if you're willing to make amendments, I might get behind it. Well, there was $50 million also as part of this bill. $25 million would have gone towards street outreach and $25 million towards structured encampments. So he agreed to change the language. And the language that was initially amended and got it out of the Senate Appropriations took out language that required law enforcement to be out there as part of outreach teams. Law enforcement doesn't want to do that. They're under-resourced. They're not interested in that. They're not mental health professionals. They don't want it. Cicero Institute wanting that in there, it doesn't make any sense. So that came out. There was a requirement of having to screen people for mental health and substance abuse. Well, if you're low barrier and you want people to come into your program, that is a no-brainer, has to come out. He agreed to take that out. The one thing he didn't agree to take out was tying funding for the municipalities to enforcing their existing camping ordinances. Didn't criminalize. There was no language in last year's bill that said it's a misdemeanor or a felony if you don't do this. And it wasn't statewide. It was if you take the money, municipality, we will require you to enforce whatever your ordinance is, and there's no penalty. Once you get the funding, there's no clawback. So that was the legislation. It still wasn't getting the support of the cities or the League of Cities and Towns, so he pulled together a group of 10 of us, Livingston did, including Jim Norton, and we agreed on language, and it was a good bill, and everybody was like, we can live with this. The Housing Coalition was in the room, so came up with language. Final week, in the session, moderate Republicans introducing it, and we're Republican-controlled legislature. And the bill got held by none other than Jim Norton and some Republicans 2 days before it was going to go forward. And he had been in the room negotiating. So that was very disappointing because we certainly needed the funding, and it may not have ended up being $50 million, but that's what happened last year. On the bright side, there was $60 million last year put into our housing trust fund, and that could have only been done with the support of the Republicans. So that's relevant to this year's story in a second. So this year there are two bills. Livingston is now chair of House Appropriations and a representative. He introduced a Cicero bill that was far worse than last year. It did make it a Class 3 misdemeanor to if you're camping, and law enforcement involvement, et cetera. So we opposed it. Last year we supported conditionally. So we opposed it, and he knew I was opposing it. I have met with him. We haven't lost the relationship. We've had conversations, and he told me a couple weeks ago, we're amending the bill, taking the criminal elements out, or the unconstitutional parts, working with the City of Phoenix lobbyist and Jim Norton. And it's a wonderful bill. Joanna Carr over there and I from Arizona, we were going over it and we're like, we can support this. So it basically says you can allow funding to go towards, it might be sprung structures, transitional shelters, congregate, non-congregate. It's like, wow, money for what we're doing. This is awesome, all the enforcement stuff. So I text Livingston, he's like, it's not good, it's not moving. So probably the same thing that happened last year is Darth Vader intervening because it's not strong enough, even though he was the one who negotiated the language with the woman from Phoenix. I haven't been directly involved this year in the negotiations because I just don't have the time, and I took a lot of heat last year. Not that I'm afraid of the heat, but this year I told him if it's going to be more severe, and I just can't get involved other than in the background. So we have a good amended bill that's probably not going to pass. And we have another bill that's potentially moving by Senator Miranda, a Democrat, without any funding. So what Livingston can do, because he has the power as a Republican, is there's still chance in the budget. He wants to see $100 million to the Housing Trust Fund. Last year it was 60. And the significance of those amounts are remarkable, right, Joanna? We had maybe $2 million towards the Housing Trust Fund the year before. So to go to 60, and now we're talking about 100, we do have the attention of a lot of our Republicans. Some of them are pretty moderate. And it's the only way we're going to get it done, even though we now have a Democratic governor. But he wants a third of that money to go what's in his bill, the bill I was just telling you about. So hopefully that can get worked out with our new Democratic governor. We face one more challenge, though. There's a referendum bill, and I don't know if it's passing. Joanna, do you know if it's made its way? So basically in Arizona, it would refer it to the voters. I think there's a huge chance it would pass because people are very fed up with the encampments. So then we'd end up having to go to have the Center for Law and join it. Neighborhoods are fed up, and right around where our 600-bed shelter is, there's a 1,000-person encampment. And the New York Times did an article last weekend, if you want to look at it. It was called "A Sandwich Shop, a Tent City, and an American Crisis." So, yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah, and I've been eating at that sandwich shop for 30 years, and it's rough. There was a body burned in a dumpster last night in the area. No, this is not, it's weekly. It's weekly, and I know the neighbors and the businesses, and they want something to happen. And these are not bad people. They want better. So I think something like that could pass, given all the frustration in the community. So in closing, my lessons are we have to find ways to work across the aisle. We have to ask. Common ground can be reached, I believe. I think we have to educate the Republicans and Democrats about humanizing it. And I talk a lot about the seniors and the disabled. I also always talk about how many deaths in our community. Last year, 1,258 people, transients, died in Maricopa County on the streets. The year before, it was less than half. And those things are connecting, so finding ways to connect. So Livingston is an ally who we never thought we would have. And by letting us sit at the table and work through the language, I guess we've defeated the worst of the Cicero bills at this point.
I think there's a couple of things from Lisa's example that stick with me. One is having an inside-outside game with different partners, the partners who have the relationships with those conservative lawmakers. It's one avenue, but it helps to have folks on the outside that are pushing at the same time. I thought the other thing that stuck out to me is just to underscore just how sneaky some of these tactics are. So going through a referendum process, doing litigation or supporting litigation at the local level, opposing their own bill when it gets improved. And in other states, we've heard about examples of people who, state legislatures that they said, okay, we're going to move on to a different topic. All of the advocates went home, only for them to bring the bill back once the advocates were out of the room. So there's a lot of really sort of sneaky maneuvering that's been happening, and we'll come back to it. It makes it a little bit more difficult. Marquea has also been leading efforts in her state around the Cicero bill. I'm wondering, Marquea, if you can provide a little overview of that bill, maybe describe some of the advocacy work that you did when you were pushing against the bill before it was enacted, and now what your advocacy efforts look like after it's been enacted.
Yeah, can you hear me? No. You can? Yes?
I think when the red light comes on.
Oh, when the light's on. Yes. Oh, when the light's on.
Yes, it was.
Okay. Sorry, so I had my mic on this whole time. Sorry. Yeah, so I think I do want to be clear and say before I even begin that it's really important that you all understand that this Cicero Institute, and then we have an outfit that is incredibly well-resourced, very, very intelligent people who, in every interaction that I've had with them have overtalked and steamrolled me. And, I consider myself to be a reasonably learned and well-spoken person, and left those conversations feeling quite small and insignificant and really confused at what had just happened. I think as communities, and I know we're going to talk in the long term about strategies for going forward, but I think it's just important to know that, this is a behemoth of an organization. There's a big push just to enact harmful legislation that criminalizes poverty. And I think in some ways our inattention to detail when it comes to policies that entrench people in their disadvantage is also criminal. And so and mind you, my first kind of exposure to this legislation was, me reading it through the lens of, being a social worker, a person of color, a person of lived experience in homelessness, and an anti-homelessness advocate. And so I think, it's also important to understand that through that lens, I think, the language in this bill is so ridiculous, so unscientific, just so bananas that you'd think there's no way in the world this could actually pass, and there's no way that any intelligent person would vote in favor of such terrible legislation. Don't be so naive. I also think that a lot of the public's perceptions about what homelessness is, why it is, and what's driving it are wrong, and a lot of times because we haven't done a great job of educating people about our successes in the work. We talk a lot about what's not working. I think folks get tired or exhausted from hearing us talk about what's not working, and so we really do need to do a better job of celebrating our success and the things that actually work. So I get really wound up and frankly pissed off when I talk about this issue, and so I've given myself 5 bullets as far as the overview of the language in the bill. So the first thing is that it becomes illegal, it becomes a Class C misdemeanor in the state of Missouri to shack up on state-owned lands. Initially, in the first iteration of the bill, because this bill, like I said, they're doing a shell game here with this legislation, and so we honestly thought that we had gotten rid of it, that we tanked the bill, and then it popped back up. It started out as House Bill 2614 and got passed as House Bill 1606. The language in the initial iteration said state land, which is really vague. And state land could be interpreted to mean anything, any land that's inside of the state. So we were really unclear about what that was about. It, would divert state funds, and again, the term state funds is very vague. We don't know if they mean state-generated funds, if they mean funds that are passed through from the feds through the states. All of that was unclear, and I think deliberately so. But it would divert state funds from evidence-based interventions, and of course, Housing First is at risk and under threat here, and divert funds from permanent housing solutions with evidence-based supportive services to provide temporary accommodations for people in state-sanctioned encampments. I think pushing people to the skids of communities and camps has never served humanity well, and I'm not being euphemistic there. It also requires that folks agree to substance use treatment, assessment, and mental health assessment, so, conflating homelessness with those other issues. Also violating people's civil liberties and forcing them to take tests that might not be relevant to their situation and experiences or culturally appropriate. It's super unclear, too, in the legislation who's doing these assessments and how they're funded. And then it threatens to snatch funding from any jurisdiction that does not demonstrably decrease their number of unsheltered people when compared to the state average. So to me, that part of the puzzle was kind of like, okay, so you're going to weaponize our point-in-time count, so all people are going to do is just not count people. I mean, it seems, it's not obviously a scientific approach, but folks in this space are very, very fearful of losing their resources to address this issue. And so I just thought, if we're so terrible at our jobs, it's certainly not because we don't care or because we don't have ideas, but probably because we don't have adequate resources to address the issue and we're doing our best with what we've got, which ain't much. And so it's unreasonable to think that by pulling money away, we would somehow magically figure out how to do a better job of this. To me, it was, counterintuitive, and I thought, clearly, if a community isn't doing well or isn't doing enough, it's because they need more of everything, not less. And then the thing for me that's, I think, the most infuriating as a social worker and as an advocate and a person that really has spent my professional career and personal life building trust within these communities is the audacity to put social workers out in the field to act as law enforcement officers enforcing terrible policies that harm people. It's antithetical to what we're even about. It's antithetical to all of our training and professional mandates. And still, in conversations with our elected officials, we didn't really get much traction. There were a couple of people were like, oh, well, that sucks, or that's hard for you guys. But the legislation managed to pass. And so we're not really in a great place in terms of trying to figure out, is any of this even legal or feasible? And if so, what are we supposed to do about it on the ground? Okay, the next question was about our advocacy. So we, at the beginning, like I said, when we first, read through the legislation, we realized that, Houston, we have a problem. Let's call some of our, folks at the state level and our departments of mental health and our housing commission, our state level advocates, service providers. Those are the group of hecklers at the table in the front here. To talk about this and to figure out what, kind of strategy we could mount against this. And I think in the end, what happened was that we were really kind of T-boned by this and really, didn't get out the gate soon enough to really get in front of it, which is why I would caution you. It's kind of like the old adage, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. I would strongly encourage you to think in your communities about mounting an offensive on this issue rather than waiting for Cicero to come to your doorstep.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I was behind you, but you can keep going, sorry.
And then the next thing, after having many, many conversations with our elected officials, even, after the legislation was passed, we realized that we weren't getting anywhere, and as this kind of drumbeat around this bill started to kind of mount, and if you think about it, if I take off my homeless advocacy hat and really think as a layperson on the streets about homelessness, a lot of the stuff in the bill kind of sounds like it makes sense. It makes sense that we're saying that it's unsafe for people to live outside, that, in many cases people do need medical and therapeutic intervention, and they need a safe place to be and prospects for employment and all those things. All those things sound wonderful, and they are, but the problem is that it's very clear that not a single person who had ever been homeless once in their life or had ever done the work that we do was involved in the process. And so some of these ideas make sense, but need a great deal of refinement, if I could put it kindly. And so we reached out to Jerry Jones at the National Alliance. I basically called him because I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't know that other colleagues in the field were having this same, these same experiences at the state level. And so I called Jerry and I was like, is this a thing that's happening elsewhere? And if so, can you help us to get a group together to figure out what we're supposed to do? And I think that that's been incredibly valuable through the Alliance pulling together a stakeholder group of, there's probably close to 100 people from all over the nation who get on the horn, once or twice a month, depending on the day, to talk about what's going on in their states and to talk about, leveraging our collective power, to escalate these conversations to the federal level, but also to raise awareness in our home communities. And, just like Cicero uses this boilerplate language that you can just copy paste from their website, literally, that we need to have tools for us in our tool belts that don't require communities who are already hustling to try to keep people alive and off the streets to then have to focus on distractions such as this one. And so we've been working on, putting together some resources to help folks out in the field to start working on this before it's too late.
I think one of the things I just want to build on there is the sort of insidious practice of framing what they're doing as being the true humanitarian way to go about it, right? So, and we saw, it's interesting that we saw the same tactic used by the Biden-Harris administration as well. Again, this is not just a Republican state issue or just conservatives that are pushing this. When National Park Service was raiding McPherson Square, they said, well, we're doing this because we just care so deeply about the unhoused people who are in McPherson Square, and we know it's unsafe for them to remain there. Not mentioning the fact that they still remain unhoused. But it's really interesting to see both the Biden-Harris administration and the Cicero Institute use that same way of posturing, that they are putting forward the right humane approach, and that all of us in the room are advocating to leave people unhoused rather than what we really are pushing for, which is to get people into housing as quickly as possible. I want to just move over to Carlton, too, to ask him if he can share about some litigation strategies that advocates have been using to push back against this sort of legislation.
Thank you. So before I can get to the strategies, I want you to think about, litigation. You ever heard the saying, right? Violence is a last resort, right? Or it should be. Litigation, in a way, is sort of a last resort. You don't want to get to the point of litigation because why? It takes years. Martin v. Boise was brought up earlier in the discussion. I mean, that took almost a decade just to litigate. Plus, it took them almost another year just to reach get to the settlement and go through all of the hoops with that. And then you have the enforcement piece that can take even longer. So the idea with combating these Cicero bills that we're discussing is more so about being able to jump in front of it. To my understanding, Cicero, these types of bills are relatively new. So litigation is forming, throughout the country. There's different lawsuits and things that have been filed. I think I was just informed of a third lawsuit possibly. I know there's two in the state of Missouri that is combating that House bill as unconstitutional. I think when you talk about litigation strategies, also know that a lot of these issues that we are discussing are constitutional, foundational rights, right? So when Martin v. Boise says that essentially you can't criminalize if there's not enough shelter space, right? If there's 10 shelter spaces in a city and there's 20 people who are experiencing homelessness, then you can't criminalize the other 10 that could, if they had nowhere else to go. But that's ultimately what ends up happening. And another point with Martin v. Boise is it's only in the Ninth Circuit.
Ninth Circuit.
Right? So the Ninth Circuit is, Arizona, California, Washington, West Coast. What does that mean for the rest of the country? That's not the law, right? It's not. There's other interpretations. Well, it's the law. But there's other interpretations that can come in, right? Because it doesn't have the persuasive authority that it has in the Ninth Circuit. So there's much work to be done to get Boise or to get Martin as a law that is adopted by all of the 13 circuits that are in the federal court circuit. Some of so I've talked about Eighth Amendment is the cruel and unusual punishment. That is Martin. The House Bill 1606 in Missouri highlights another issue with a lot of these laws is just attacking the vagueness of the law. So I think that one of the things is, I'll just read it because it's better to read the language of the case law than to make it up, right? So the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits states from punishing people under a criminal law so vague that it fails to give ordinary people fair notice of the conduct it punishes, or so standardless that it invites arbitrary enforcement. All right, and that's from Johnson v. United States, the United States Supreme Court, 2015. So we all need to know what our conduct is that is illegal. If the law is vague, then you don't, arguably, right, you don't know what that what you are doing is illegal. So those constitutional legal challenges is when you see these phrases and these terms that are in the bill. That's another due process clause, 14th Amendment type of argument that you can use to invalidate either the whole bill or that section, that part of the bill that is unclear and it's vague. So you see that in that particular issue in the lawsuit. But again, the most effective strategy towards attacking this is just jumping in front of it before it gets to the point of litigation. One thing I'll also read that came in from our legal director, this is fresh off the presses, is that, just saying it like this, so most of this legislation limits the flexibility of local municipalities. So cities, right? They want to maintain, their jurisdiction, the power that's in their jurisdiction. They don't want the state to come in and override what they're doing. You see that all the time. The United States was founded off of that type of debate, right? We're talking about, federalism and maintaining the thing. I won't bore you. I won't get into all of that. But what I'm in a similar strand, this is what this is, right? Local municipalities want to decide what policies to implement and enforce in their cities, in their areas. So one advocacy tool that you can use in terms of knowing that is to make sure that you can get representatives from the city on your side, and we'll talk about solutions where that has actually worked to get these to attack these statewide camping ban legislative bills. So kind of reaching out to them early, getting in their ear, educating them, and talking to them about best practices. That's how you avoid litigation. So kind of in short, we want to avoid litigation. Yes, there are lawsuits that have been filed in Missouri, in Arizona, but the common issues that I discussed today about the Eighth Amendment, the Martin v. Boise, the void for vagueness, these are the type of things that advocates are on the horn talking about on a regular basis. One other thing is that with the Law Center, we have so you go to homelessness.org. You go to support our. If you go to Housing Not Handcuffs, right, you'll see it on the tab. We have an interactive map of this exact thing that we're talking about today. So you can see on the map where it's different colors and states where these types of bills have been introduced. And then you can wave your little mouse over the icon, and it kind of pops up, shows the bill, and kind of what happened to the bill, or where it's at in the particular stage of the legislative process. And let me tell you, we do have positive examples of how that type of advocacy we're discussing, where they got in front of this issue and were able to get the bill killed in committee or otherwise just not taken up at all. Lastly, I know I said lastly a few times. I come from the church, all right. So we got some time. But amen. But there's a man, right, whose name is Judge Glock, and he's not a judge. But he used to work for the Cicero Institute, but now he works for the Manhattan Institute. So check that out, right? So people move around, right? So they're going to spread that perception and spread those ideologies. They have proof of concept based on what I talked about earlier with Austin. They say, hey, this statewide override strategy works. All right, I'm not at Cicero no more. Let me take it over here to the Manhattan Institute. And then, hey, maybe one day, he might be the head of the interagency homelessness council of the federal government. You never know. You have to kind of watch and track where where folks go. But my point is, there was a bill introduced in Kansas that Judge Glock was a part of and advocating for. And you had about 20 or so, different advocacy organizations that showed up to the State House and really voiced their displeasure against the bill and trying to educate the state legislators, and they got it killed. They got it killed in committee, and there was no support on the other side for Cicero other than Judge Glock and a few other people that were there because they did not anticipate that you would show up, right? So you've heard it many times, but I think when you show up and you educate and you are willing to be in these people's faces and get in their ear and talk to them about why these statewide legislative bill, camping bills, statewide bans and jailing and having the AG involved and all of the stuff that we see going on, it's a very bad idea. So continue to advocate against this.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you wanted to add on?
I did. Carlton actually helped me think about something I meant to share. So we had the League of Cities and Towns in the negotiating table. They were against the bill. And so every city, they're representing every city and town in the state. So that is definitely a strategy. You want them at the table. We had multiple cities, the Housing Coalition, the first year where we were negotiating language. And without those, Senator Livingston being willing to negotiate it, they could have just pushed that bill through. But because of the relationships, he thought it was valuable, and he was relying on experts. And in the hearings, he would call me out as the expert in front of everyone. This is the expert I'm relying on. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I really do have to work on this. And I mentioned I was taking heat for it by some folks, but I think we have to sit at the table. Get your League of Cities and Towns involved. And there are 3 lawsuits in Phoenix that I want to mention briefly. The neighborhoods and businesses around the encampment in that New York Times article sued for a declaration of a public nuisance against the city of Phoenix. If they get that, that could be precedent setting across the country in a very challenging way. The city of Phoenix is kind of paralyzed to take any kind of action. They're cleaning in that 1,000-person encampment, but they're not going to do any enforcement. They're paralyzed by the various lawsuits. The second lawsuit is the ACLU. Oh, and prior to that, the Department of Justice started an investigation for search and seizure of properties. And I think it's the ACLU one that just resulted in an injunction. And the city now, when they seize items or take items when they're doing cleanup, have to store those items so that people can come and get them. So we have a lot of litigation that's causing some paralysis and fear in the cities, understandably, right now.
We've come at you with a lot of information, but I know that we don't have all the answers here. There's a lot of folks who are here in this room who are actively pushing against this legislation. So I'd love to open it up to your questions, your thoughts, your ideas. And we can start with you, William. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you very much. Bill Higgins, Homeless Advocacy for All, and I'm from Portland, Maine. I got to know someone was in an unsheltered community about 5 years ago. And up in Maine, we don't have many, back then, didn't have many unsheltered. But I met Amanda Richer through Invisible People. Mark Horvath had interviewed her. And that video has been viewed around 5 million times. But one of the things that she said during the video is, if we keep talking about it, all there's going to be is talk. And people are dying out there. And that was 5 years ago. Just think of now what's gone on since then, how many more unsheltered people. I like what Markea said, that these people are in the community. If we start referring them as communities of people, not encampments, that changes the perspective. Because these are people that help each other. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
Hear me anyway? Okay. I'm from New York. My name is Maria Forbes. I'm a New York City Housing Authority Tenant Association president. And we have an enormous amount of homelessness, not just with the asylum. We have people who are sitting in shelters and have sat in shelters for over several years. And they're not receiving any assistance. And my concern is, with the asylum being pushed, that the ones who are in the shelter will not get the service in which they're entitled to, because they were on the waiting list for apartments first. So then they lose out because my government is, in a sense, is crazy, because he's not staying in his lane. If it's a federal issue, then the federal issue. But because he let them get off the bus, I guess it became a city issue. But we still have families who have been sitting. I consider them to be homeless. They've been waiting for apartments, and they've been sitting there for over several years. What could be done to address that those people are actually serviced? Like, some of them are literally waiting on public housing waiting lists for over 2 and I have to say maybe up to 6 and 7 years, because they have to reapply every 2 years. And if they don't, they get dropped from that waiting list. But do they remember that while they're in the shelter? So it just becomes an annoying situation to see that they may be looked over, because we have another crisis of people being homeless and being provided whatever shelter assistance they need. So my question is, where do we get the help from? I'm a public housing resident, in assisting the rights of people who are homeless in our city that were already there. Do you understand my question?
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that what you're getting at is really the underlying reason for why we're seeing this housing crisis in the first place. And that's because of our elected officials' collective failure in addressing people's needs, not just in the past couple of years, but for decades, right? We have this affordable housing crisis. We know that there's a severe shortage of homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. We have all this federal dollars going out to build housing, but the housing that's being built isn't actually affordable to people who need it. And we've been chronically underfunding that, even the programs we do have, for decades. And all of that is pushing more and more and more people into homelessness. More people are becoming, are unsheltered, experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And that's sort of what the public is reacting to, right? They're seeing the end result of decades of failure. And I think it's really important for all of us, as we're talking to our elected officials, not just to be focusing on the immediate needs of people who are unhoused, but taking a step back and looking at, how do we even prevent homelessness in the first place? And that's through affordable, accessible, safe, decent housing for everybody. So I think that's part of the conversation here, but I also want to turn it over to my colleagues, too, to add on.
Well, I would just add, just to piggyback on what Sarah just said, what we're experiencing in this country is structural issues that continue to increase homelessness. It continues to grow unabated because we've been forced into a scarcity model. So we've accepted the idea that if you give us just enough money, then we'll back off and we'll take it, and we'll be able to handle some of the people that are experiencing homelessness, but we'll never get to the ultimate solution. We house millions of people every year, but guess what happens? Millions more show up. And we have seen more people evicted over the last year than we did before the moratorium on evictions and COVID. Something's wrong with that. We have to make sure that we don't continue to abandon what was successful for us in the first place. So what was successful in this movement was grassroots organizing. Some of you may be as old as me. I've been doing this for about 28 years. I remember Housing Now. I remember really forcing the federal government to pay attention to the issues. What we have to do, I think someone said it on this panel, we have to educate the public. Everybody who's elected has people that they are responsible to and responsible for. We have to educate those people. And a lot of that is telling the true story about who is homeless, what homelessness is, and why people got there. We don't do enough of that. I think Marquita said, did I say it right? Okay, Marquita said that we often talk about the problem and not enough about the real solutions. People who are making their way through homelessness. So we got to do more storytelling, and we got to do it in the field. And I want to recognize Jerry Jones. Well, really quickly, let me just finish.
A little piece, just a little piece. We need to be able to get in on the bill writing of all aspects of it. And then I just want to, we got to change saying affordable to minimum wage. Minimum wage housing needs to be put in there.
But really quickly, we do a lot of really good work here. All of us, most of us represent national organizations. We're on the Hill every day. We're talking to the administration. We're asking the Biden administration to put a moratorium on criminalization. They haven't done it yet. That's because power concedes nothing without protest. And so what we're doing, what Jerry's doing, what we're doing is we're on the ground in communities. We're doing a tour around the country right now. We're helping to educate elected officials, helping to present strategies and best practices. That's what we have to do. Criminalization is not a national issue, because those decisions are made at the local and state level. So we have to empower people. I think someone else said it here. People are operating shelters and helping people every day. They don't have time as much for advocacy, so we got to get out there and we got to help them. I think that's the solution. We got to get on the ground and hold people accountable in those elected offices.
And I think also bridge the divide between folks who work on homelessness and folks who work on housing. Sometimes they're like two separate silos, but the true solution to homelessness is a housing market that works for everybody. And so the only way we can really get this done is if we're all pulling together, making new relationships, building bridges with partners, looking to city officials, looking to new voices that we can bring to the table, and working collectively in that same direction. Why don't we take a question from over here?
I'll try to be real quick. It's a question. I'm in New York City with, as a as an advocate. And one of the things that I've been doing is I've worked closely with the Adams administration in New York City to address housing and homelessness. And so there's this big thing with such an overwhelming number of people that are experiencing homelessness, and many that are going into the streets and stuff like that. And then Adams' desire to address it in a way that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And there's some type of balance. When I first stood with him to address these issues, he was indicating that he's going to put people in congregate shelters. I described those facilities as being congregate death traps, and I told him that no one would go in there, and those numbers reflected that. But I pushed for him to develop one of the safe haven models that Charles King is good at presenting, and having facilities with services on site and different type of things to help people access housing faster. But as we move more into this, what I call a triple crisis of homelessness that's been there, the lack of truly affordable housing that's been there, and then now this migrant crisis, I see that things are going to be extremely challenging. I think at the root of it, based on what you were saying, is the reality that we are incapable at this point of producing the amount of housing that we need. With the homeless population in New York City getting to about, I believe, if the numbers are, if we get to the right numbers, is about 100,000 or more people that are sheltered homeless. So we don't even have an accurate count of those that are unsheltered. But I just see that it could potentially get worse with the inability to produce the type of housing that's needed, which unfortunately is leading to the rise in what I call a homeless shelter industrial complex. It doesn't work for anybody. So the question is, and I have a more proactive than reactive approach in these recent years of trying to address these issues. The question is, I mean, my push with the administration and other stakeholders is for everybody to get together. It's like all hands on deck to try and figure out sensible solutions to these crises. So do you know how, from a broader perspective, how we can best address this in a way that is sensible but also humane and actually solve the problem that we're seeing instead of putting a Band-Aid on it? I see some models that seem right, and we talk about those things in terms of encampments and organized encampments and stuff like that. But I personally don't see that as a solution.
Sarah?
And I'm looking for something that might be more of a solution that gets people housed.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there are lots of thoughts here. I would just point to there are a lot of cities that are doing a remarkable job of addressing unsheltered homelessness. Houston, let's give a shout out to Houston. They are doing incredible work. They've worked across different silos to bring folks together from different sectors of government and services. They are dedicated to a housing first approach, and they are moving people faster than ever before into housing. They've made a huge impact there. That's a really great model to look at. There are other places that are doing really well too. Seattle comes to mind. They just passed an Apple Health and Housing legislation that treats homelessness as a public health issue and puts the resources behind it to make sure that people have access to those resources and services. But I want to look to my colleagues.
Can I jump in here?
Go ahead.
So we run a 600-bed adult shelter, and to the woman from New York, people do linger in shelter because we don't have enough housing resources and vouchers to connect them to permanent housing. And I will tell you firsthand, some of the government funders are not that interested in funding at the level we know we need to be funded at. We went from 470 to 600 beds at pre-pandemic funding levels, and we were asking for additional support. Yeah, we can raise so much private money, but it's a challenge. I do not think congregate shelters are the way of the future. I'm glad to see, and I think it's in the USICH or in various reports, the push towards non-congregate. I think it's better for people. I know it's certainly better for the seniors when we did that during the pandemic. I also think we've got to get really creative about new models and new ways of getting people rehoused, roommate sharing, and all these best practices. I don't have the answer to all of them. I just know we have to ask that critical question because what we're doing now, we're not going to deal with this rising tide. Transitional housing also needs to be funded at higher levels, I think, too.
I think I'll say really quickly for those of you in the room who might be attorneys or social workers, whatever. We have a Housing Not Handcuffed Justice Network where advocates from all over the country, and a lot of them are attorneys, just so happen to be attorneys, but that's not by you don't have to be one. Where we're talking about different strategies of how to address and attack Cicero in particular in some of these bills, and just it's not exactly to the point of what you're talking about addressing, but I think. Look at that Housing Not Handcuffs Justice Network, or you can endorse it. It's on our website. Another thing that I could say that, again, for anyone who's an attorney or in the room, them, my role is to go into some of these, major law firms and to do what I'm telling you to do is to try to educate some of their attorneys so that they will work on these matters that we have with the National Homelessness Law Center. And so that's just trying to work. What I'm getting at is you got to work it from all angles, right? Go to the corporate firms and say, hey, like you can use your skills and your talents and your abilities to help really address this social justice issue that is it's a crisis. And so for all of us in our different spheres of influence need to think outside of the box to solve this problem.
And I would just add one other thing, and this may not be as popular as some of the other things that have been said today. I think we also have to look internally. We have to figure out why a person would rather sleep on the sidewalk in freezing temperatures than inside our shelters. Mm-hmm. So we have to do a much better job of creating services that people want to go to, and I don't think we address that issue enough.
I was actually going to say that same thing. I think that we have to be very careful as homeless response systems to not play into the hands of folks like Cicero in that, some of our nationally recognized best practices are great ideals, but they're not resourced appropriately, and we're not able to effectively run our programs at scale without flaming out all of our staff, flaming out our client populations, and those that provide housing for them, landlords and so on. And so to me, the question that we're looking at internally as we reflect on this is how can we shore up our existing infrastructure in our programs to ensure that we are providing the best quality care for people and not just a roof over their house, over their head. We want them to have meaningful, wonderful, beautiful lives too, and not just be out of view. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, and this isn't about blaming and shaming, but we do have to take responsibility for the quality of care and the stewardship of folks' care. And I'm not certain that we're always doing that to the greatest effect. So we have folks that are housed, but they're still homeless, or they're housed, but they still defer back to their safe communities outside because that's where they go to get support. I know many people in permanent supportive housing who are living in deplorable conditions, places where you wouldn't want your family members to lay their head, where no one's checking on them, no one's making sure that they're responsive if they, haven't answered the door in a few days. We've got outreach workers who are working as de facto case managers for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in a program because an individual is spiraling and they don't have a worker. All of that stuff needs to change. We can't play into this narrative and expect that folks would not have the negative perceptions of our programs when we know, and I'm not beating up on any of us by saying this, but we know that what we're doing is not adequate. It's just not adequate to say, okay, you're inside, sayonara, sucker, hope you win, This is really about helping folks to identify the supports and resources that they need to have a wonderful experience on this earth. That's what I want for them.
And that's a beautiful note to end on. Please help me thank our speakers for joining us today.